Christina. It's so amazing to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us. The last piece of our program was written by Ethel Smyth.
Ethel Smyth is an English composer. She was also a writer, so not just writing music, but she was also writing really important essays and texts as well. Just basic facts, she was born in April of 1858 and died in May of 1944. So she's kind of spanning this end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, which is a really important turning time in the history of the world, right? So she's active in a very, very many important moments of history. She kind of gained her reputation and why she's known today, her reputation at the time and her reputation today, as a forefront of the women's suffrage movement, as an active feminist and an active participant in fighting for women's rights during her lifetime. So her musical education begins in Germany, actually. She was educated in Germany and kind of ran in many famous circles with Brahms and Clara Schumann and a lot of the composers that really formed many of the ideals, right, of like the classical world of music happening in German and Viennese circles. So yes, she is an English composer, but she was educated in Germany and really identified with a lot of what was going on socially, politically, and musically in Germany. So that's an important part of her story. And this plays into the fact that even though she has an incredible output of music, and a lot of it is incredibly influential and very important and active, right, especially in political movements, she's not as easily loved or published or performed in English circles during her time. At this time, women were not getting their works easily performed. It was not an easy feat. She actually performed a lot of her music when it was performed by orchestras. She did not write out her full name. She would just write her initials, E.M. Smyth. And so people were actually surprised because she got all these incredible reviews in the paper, but then they were surprised to find out this work was actually by a woman. And then once that started to become more apparent, it became harder and harder for her works to be performed and published and well loved in especially British circles at the time. She was well aware of her skill as a composer and the fact that she had something to say, right? She's not just writing music for music's sake. She was highly involved in society and politics at the time. She was not one of those people who just kind of knew it was happening, but sat on the sidelines and continued her art, you know, alongside what was happening. She was actively participating. So in about 1910, she meets Emmeline Pankhurst, who is one of the founders of the British suffrage movement, and she is the head of the Women's Social and Political Union, which was this very, very almost militant activist group that was fighting for women's rights and supporting feminist ideals in England during this time. So she's meeting all these people who run in these huge circles, right? Really, really important circles. And instead of just saying like, oh, I'm this composer, I can write you some music, she becomes part of the movement. She's attending the union meetings. She actually gets arrested alongside members of the union for throwing rocks through people's windows who opposed the suffrage movement. And she winds up in jail for 2 whole months, imprisoned for, damaging property while she is protesting for women's rights. So she is right there at the front of this and writing music that ends up becoming anthems, right? Anthems for the women's suffrage movement, not just in England, but throughout the world. So that's kind of where she gets her like world-renowned claim to fame, and well-deservedly.
Wow, fascinating.
She was someone who knew her value, knew her worth, and was not afraid to fight for herself. And she did. She fought for herself till the end of her life.
So tell us a little bit about Ethel Smyth's contribution to the world of opera.
Absolutely. So above all else, Ethel Smyth wanted to be an opera composer in her career. That was kind of a benchmark for her. She is alive at a time, right, where there are already so many incredible operas and so many other incredible operas being written at the time. So she kind of right away wanted to write librettos, collaborate with librettists, and write opera. A lot of her operas were very interesting to look at. Some of them, the first act would have music and text, and the second half would actually be completely instrumental. So she was definitely original in her composition of opera. She writes an opera called Der Wald, which gets premiered in Berlin in Germany, but then in 1902, it comes to the United States and becomes the first opera written by a woman to be premiered at the Metropolitan Opera in New York City. And so this event is incredible, right? An incredible accomplishment for a woman to get a work performed at such an incredible and well-respected opera house. And it's even hard for me to say that, like, we think of that as incredible, right? Because, you know, she should just be considered like any other composer, but we know, right, with the history of Western classical music, that that's not the truth, that women were seen as inferior to men. So it was hard for them to get premieres and to get performances. So hard, in fact, that for the next 113 years, the Metropolitan Opera does not see another opera by a woman or a composer that identifies as female until the 2016-2017 season, where they bill Kaya Sarajevo's Le Mar de Loin. So 113 years between Ethel Smyth's Der Wald and Sarajevo's Le Mar de Loin. That's incredible to me.
I think that entire story is a great example of the importance of patience and persistence and action for the things in this world, and especially in art, that we feel need to be represented and need to be out there and performed and supported. Because while change does happen historically over time, you know, I think things progress and we all end up in a positive direction. These things sometimes take a lot of time, even when that initial breakthrough is made. So, you know, it's not just enough to have one thing happen. It's about action and consistency and persistence in creating the world that we want to live in. So fascinating. Thank you so much again for sharing all of these interesting historical moments with us today. And we really appreciate it, Christina. Take care.
Thanks, Katie.